My name is Filippo. I'm with Siemens in Germany, Munich, and I'm very happy to be here today, not only because it's been a very interesting congress so far, and I've had the pleasure to visit for the first time the city of Łódź, but also because it's the first business trip after a year and a half of home office, where I've had the pleasure to meet people face to face and not through a monitor. So I'm very glad to be here. Today, I'd like to show you a couple of examples of how mobility as a service solutions, software solutions, can help cities thrive, including industrial cities, through the combination of various transport services and various IT services. Let me start perhaps with a quick personal perspective. As I said, I live in Munich now for a long time. Before that, I spent time in Los Angeles, in California, where I was getting a PhD in transportation engineering. But I am from Livorno. This is a city, in the west of Tuscany. It's a harbor. And I think it's in a way a bit fitting that I've been called to speak at this conference, because Livorno has some characteristics of a post-industrial city. And even some parallel histories with which I've read a bit about. Both Livorno and Łódź were created as open cities for the wish of a ruling monarch, essentially. Livorno was created as a harbor, and people were called to fill the city with population, people looking for work and for freedom. And indeed, Livorno also had a fairly substantial thriving economy up until the 70s, so that the timing is perhaps a bit different. And then it experienced a fairly sharp decline due to a variety of reasons, so that suddenly people were started moving out and depopulating the city. And perhaps like Łódź, at least that's my impression, Livorno has started sort of the path to a new birth by diversifying its services and perhaps building luxury yachts rather than servicing containers. Now, let me introduce perhaps who I work for and who pays my trip here. This is, many of you perhaps know Siemens as, a manufacturer of trains and trams and metros, and we do that too, not myself. The unit I work for is actually the world leader in the development of software solutions for mobility as a service, as a general umbrella name, solutions for journey planning, for mobile payment, mobile ticketing for public transport. We have with a group of brands and companies, which include Hakon, Bytemark, a company in New York, EOS Trade in Hamburg, Padam in Paris. We have about 700 people working exclusively at developing software solutions for mobility as a service. And we work with customers all over the world, essentially, mainly in Europe, North America, and the Middle East. Our partners and customers are mainly cities, public transport operators, but also rail operators. In Poland, for instance, the trip planning app of PKP is something that we did several years back. We've worked with the trip planner and the applications of the German railways. The Deutsche Bahn was actually the first customer which we had many years ago. But we work with Dubai, with San Francisco, with Berlin, but also with smaller cities like Mainz, Innsbruck. And we recently developed a system for Andorra, for the Principate of Andorra, which has 70,000 inhabitants and about 8 million tourists a year, at least before COVID. What I'd like to show is, of course, mobility has changed a lot in the last decades. You have public transport on one hand, which has been there for over a century, virtually unchanged, with again, with with services which haven't changed significantly in the past. But you also have, in the last decades, we've seen a proliferation of so-called shared or micro-mobility services, such as e-scooters, e-bikes, shared car, ride-hailing. You have many here in which I experienced that myself. And definitely, transportation and mobility has become more user-friendly. We don't know whether it's become easier, and the key question is whether it has become more sustainable. And I think this is a key question for cities, that cities have to ask themselves, because for a city to be attractive to its customers, which are the citizens, which are us basically, it has to be, of course, user-friendly. It has to be tailored, offering tailored service to the users, but it also has to be sustainable. And luckily, there are solutions, not easy, and as Micha said, there's a lot that needs to be done, but there are also things which are perhaps less difficult than a long-term planning, and perhaps can help even on the short or at least the midterm. Public transport, we've seen it. It's the key. It's the backbone of mobility. It's often called. There's no way around it. However, it is important that it's actually effectively used. So it doesn't make sense to have public transport running at 10% of capacity, as I heard last night. It is happening here in Łódź. For it to happen, public transport, which is traditionally moving people according to schedules from stop to stop, needs to be complemented with other modes. Other modes can be, for instance, scooters, bikes, pretty much anything that helps people get to their destination, the so-called first or last mile. It's not enough to... Public transport cannot be improved by simply increasing the number of lines or of buses, or even making tickets cheaper or even for free. These things are possible, but they need to be part of a larger solution that perhaps requires thinking about new tariffs or new ways of payment. In Germany, we started a couple of projects which use the so-called CHIBO, check-in, be out, that helps people buy a ticket without having to worry about which tariff to buy. Tariffs in Germany can be very complex, believe me. And especially the fact, with COVID, or this hopefully post-COVID situation we're in, people start going to the office not every weekdays as before, but perhaps only twice a week or once a week. And so new tariffs need to be developed that take into account the actual need of travelers. Another example of solutions that really helps is that of demand-responsive transport. We see in most cities, public transport, buses and trams run full, or at least well-served at peak, in peak periods in the city centers, but they tend to be half empty perhaps at night or in the suburbs. And particularly for the suburbs, solutions like demand-responsive transport can help, on one hand, offer a more user-friendly service, because essentially people can be picked up at home, or at least close to home, and only on demand, meaning only when they need it. And by doing that, the operation costs can be somewhat lowered, obviously not completely excluded, but they can be lowered, improving essentially the output performance of public transport operators. What's important is that demand-responsive transport, which I assume many of you are familiar with, essentially it's using a smartphone to call a minivan or a minibus, so a smaller bus than a big Mercedes one, for instance, or even it can be a large taxi, only when you need this service. This is not a money-making operation, so it it requires subsidies, as does public transport. However, it can become sustainable if it's done in conjunction, so as a complement to public transport. So for instance, buses, minibuses like this here in the Paris region are used to take people to the next commuter train station, or that they are used to take people to a campus of a particular company. And so this is another tool that public transport operators and cities can use to support their sustainable operation. The digital counterpart to public transport and micromobility service is often known as mobility as a service, which again, probably very known to all of us. It's essentially having the option of many transport mode, that you can plan a trip using a sequence of these modes. You can book them, you can pay for them, with one user interface, with one app. So we call it, plan, book, pay and travel. Mobility as a service, there's been a lot of debate about who should be responsible for it, and there still are. I believe very strongly that Miast, as it's often called, is public responsibility. It doesn't mean that it has to be done only by the public authorities, but the public authorities need to step up and fulfill their responsibility of providers of public services to make sure that mobility as a service is done sustainably and not, for instance, done based on, an Uber who obviously has different interest than making sure that people travel environmentally friendly. And it's important whenever offering, for instance, trip planning services, to realize that different users have different objectives. And so I may want the quickest trip if I'm in a hurry. I may want the cheapest trip if I'm a student. Or here, for instance, this is an app from Luxembourg, I may want to see how environmentally friendly, how much CO2 my trip options are going to consume. And if I do that, perhaps I'm going to take the bike, and the app can help me see how the weather is doing, and or even the slope of my ride bike. Berlin, I was showing that earlier to Jan, has an app for kids, because they've recognized that if kids start early to use public transport and get away from this mood that public transport is not cool, then they basically will continue doing that in later years. And so they have, we've developed with the city of Berlin, we've developed an app that has a very simple user interface and even a call button for help if I'm lost somewhere. Recently, Frankfurt has created an app that provides COVID-19 adjusted routing. It's basically looking for trips which minimize the chance of contacts. So by using, for instance, buses which are less full, or tram or trains which are less full, or transfer points which are outside and have less contact with other people. These are all possibilities offered by technology, essentially. Important is that mobility and trip planning is accessible to everyone. And again, this is a responsibility of a city, and it's part of the services to the citizens to make this accessible to everyone, by taking care that the elevators work, for instance, but also that the information about the status of elevators reaches the users through a trip planning app that has this information. The cities have the opportunity to use something called the mobility marketplace, which is essentially a mobility platform made up of several components: journey planning, transaction, ticketing, payment, customer management, user management, but also you see the service APIs to different user interfaces, different apps, which for instance can also be managed by private companies. Again, what we believe is important is that the city is responsible not necessarily for operating the services, but for orchestrating them, for making sure that they work jointly and not that they work against each other. And with this, I conclude, and sort of what I'd like to take with you is that, again, mobility is a key element of the index of the quality of livability in a city, and it's very important that public transport remains a key component of mobility, of the mobility offering, but that public transport is an effectively used public transport by the citizen. It is also important that the micromobility services or DRT services that are available nowadays are complement public transport for the first and last mile, and we've seen Miast as the sort of the digital counterpart of transport services with this plan, book, and pay concept, and we believe very strongly that cities must fulfill their responsibility as orchestrator of mobility services. And with this, I think I used up my time, and I'd like to conclude. Thank you very much.